Welcome to Face to Face. This is a show about change and what's next. It's a show that asks questions and peels back the layers of our average everyday experience and goes beyond scratching the surface. We interview people doing incredible things who are making a difference around the globe. Join me as we listen in and get one step closer to understanding that big ideas shared create collaboration. Collaboration can inspire community, and communities create social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face to Face. Today's interview was a real treat for me. It's with celebrated Canadian filmmaker Adam Egoyan, who has probably best known for Exotica, The Sweet Hereafter, more recently The Captive and Chloe, and a whole series of films. Check them out online. We're going to have links on the bio for sure. But today was a real treat for me because we were able to talk about more than just Adam Egoyan as a filmmaker. We talked about him as a philosopher and as an existentialist and as a guy who cares deeply about a variety of global issues and who studied international relations as a university student who clearly still has a heart for social justice of all kinds. I think you're going to really enjoy today's conversation actually, not really an interview. It's a conversation. And we talked about a lot of things and a lot of connecting points for a whole lot of people there for sure. So listen in, lean in a little closer. I think you're going to draw a whole lot from today's chat. And for me, we just scratched the surface. I could have sat there for hours with Adam and continued, and I hope we'll have an opportunity to do another interview in the real near future. Check out his new movie, Remember. It's going to be coming out soon. Don't know when it's being released, but I've already am starting to hear some pretty good things. Well, welcome to Face to Face, sure. And I am sitting here with Adam Egoyan. I can't believe it. We're at his office here, surrounded by film posters and articles and so on. Adam, thank you for joining us today. Yeah, pleasure. So I'm going to do my best not to talk about movies today. Yes, good idea. Good idea. As I look at a poster of Exotica, it's going to be a challenge. But there's so many touch points with your life. You know, I think we could talk philosophy. We could talk international relations. I mean, you studied international relations. Yes, I actually came to Toronto to study international relations at Trinity College, and I had been doing drama at high school, plays, but I had this idea that I wanted to be a diplomat, that I traveled the world solving international crises while writing plays. While you were writing plays. Yes, of course. I know like a right. Paul Claudel or something like that. Smoking French cigarettes, right, sitting on the balcony in Bali somewhere. Yeah. And so, it didn't quite work out that way. When I was at U of T, there was a film club at Hart House, and I started making short films. And, pretty much into my second or third year, I realized this is what I wanted to do. But I did finish my degree in international relations. I did write my thesis, which was on the question of national self-determination, focusing on Armenia. I'm Armenian. Focusing on Armenia after the genocide during the Paris Peace Conference. And it's an interesting period because it's one of the few times when two leaders from completely opposing ideologies, Lenin and Woodrow Wilson, both espoused the same theory, the idea of national self-determination. And they both used Armenia, the newly independent state, as an example of what self-determination could mean. Now, they had very different perspectives about it. I think Woodrow was genuinely altruistic. Right. And of course, his altruism, led to his defeat when he brought all his ideas back to the U.S. He was defeated by Congress because actually the U.S. wanted to have a mandate for Armenia, while the rest of Europe was at the Paris Peace Conference looking at all the extraordinary wealth of these former, Ottoman Empire, the oil reserve was sort of a treasure that the New World hadn't seen since the discovery of, gold, in the Americas. So this was like an incredible bounty that everyone was carving up, but America wanted to have Armenia because of Woodrow's altruism, that this was a Christian country that had been decimated by this genocide and it needed support. Lenin was a bit more cynical. He basically felt that with the rise of communism, questions of nationalism would just sort of float away. But in the meantime, he had to kind of bring all of these fringe countries into the Soviet fold, so he promised a national self-determination. Anyway, sorry. So if I wasn't surrounded with all the memorabilia and the film posters and so on, I'd go, you're an academic. Are you an academic who makes films?
What it came down to is that I felt that I didn't have when I was studying this, first of all, it became clear to me that to work in the Foreign Service would require years of being in Ottawa and in a low-level bureaucratic position, and I just couldn't fathom that.
And a ridiculous exam that you have to pass.
The exam was daunting.
Yeah, it really
was daunting.
I've looked at it.
And I felt I wouldn't be able to pass that exam. And frankly, my French sucked. I can speak better French now than I could then, but I wouldn't, as a Canadian diplomat, that's something that was also daunting. But I just felt that it was, I'm still very interested in that. I was a subscriber to Foreign Affairs for a number of years, and I followed this all quite rigorously. But at a certain point, you know what your passion is, and for me, it was.
It's interesting you bring that up, because I wanted to, on the drive down, I wrote a couple questions down as I was coming into Toronto, and I, clearly, it seems to me that the films that you've made have many layers, but you seem to want to change the way people see the world. In the words of D.W. Griffith, you want to alter the way we see. John Berger, seeing comes before words, etc. So you want to change the way I think about relationships or forgiveness or tragedy or loss, etc. Why didn't? I mean, you could have been the diplomat. You could have been the politician. You could have been a teacher, it seems to me. And it sounds like you're sitting there. It sounds like you kind of still are. In fact, you teach at the European Graduate Film School, do you not?
Yeah, my practice is divided into two things. There are the stories I tell through film and through drama. There are the skills I have as a director, so I've been directing opera, and that to me is very satisfying and something that I know I can plug into. But I also have come to understand that my celebrity, if you will, has given me a forum to discuss other ideas. So in this particular year, with the 100th anniversary of the genocide, there were invitations to write about this. There were invitations to speak about this. There have been, and I've embraced those because I do think I have that language. I do have that ability as well. So there is this idea of affecting people in terms of looking at alternate realities, alternate sort of experiences, better understanding the human condition. That is, I think, an extraordinary aspect of what drama does. It allows us to enter into someone else's view of the world, someone else's experience of the world. It helps us better understand aspects of ourselves. It maybe allows us to deal with pain, trauma, allows us to see how other human beings cope with extraordinary situations. That is all very compelling. But I also think that there is this question of information, allowing people to have access to specific experiences or specific circumstances that they may not be aware of. And that might alter their world in a very fundamental way just by having the information. And some of my films touch on that. I'm less interested in that, honestly, in drama than I am in one-on-one or on situations where I've been able to be in a public position to write about. And in the case of the Armenian genocide, what most people don't understand is the corrosive effects of the denial of this and the mechanics of that and the amazing amount of money and time and effort that the Turkish state puts into denying this event. And that actually has made the Armenian situation quite unique. So it's interesting when we talk about, for instance, the situation in Cambodia where there isn't denial, but there seems to be this erasure of memory, which is internal. Where the victims have actually, from my perspective, kind of dropped the ball in terms of what it means to have sustained that type of cataclysmic event.
Like a coping mechanism almost, of a sort.
Right. So I'm interested to learn about that. As an Armenian, I'm interested to talk to you about that situation. So when you refer to a Buddhist tradition, I want to know about that because it's interesting to me. I don't know enough about that.
Right.
I haven't heard people speak about that. So and those types of exchanges are often done through through more academic work. But that being said, there have been films about that. There's a film that was nominated for an Academy Award a couple of years ago, dealing with the effects of the Khmer Rouge. It was an animated film. I don't know if you saw this.
Yes, Ricky Pa's film.
Right.
Yeah.
So that to me is interesting. So we do have a conduit. We do have access to that, but probably that has to be supplemented at a certain point.
Well, I think too I think for a lot of people, I mean, with places like Armenia and Cambodia in particular, those two, if you were to go and head out on the street, most folks that I've met anyway don't really have an understanding.
Right.
I mean, don't really even have an understanding of what genocide really is, how, what was the scope, and there's some controversy around these things, as usual. And then you get, of course, your trials that it's in the press and people start to hear about it. But it seems to me a lot of people's understanding of Cambodia, for instance, would be war films, maybe, if they're lucky. There's a reference in Apocalypse Now because they're going into Cambodia. There's, the killing fields and so on. Lots of people have seen that stuff, but they don't really, there's not a peeling back of the layers.
Well, and then we have to ask, well, what motivates that? And I think what motivates that is the pain of the victims. And if in the case of Cambodia, if the victims are not exhibiting pain, well, then what is the motivation for the outside world to peel back those layers? So much of the work that was done this year with the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide is to say there's still pain. When the Pope makes his statement, he talks about an open wound.
Right.
And so that alerts people, oh, well, this is ongoing. And so because it's ongoing, then you do have extraordinary things happening in the past month, like Germany accepting the Armenian genocide, accepting a degree of complicity on their part, Austria, accepting it. And, these are monumental events, but they're based on the sense that there is residual pain. What fascinates me right now, having this conversation, is, well, what happens in the case of Cambodia, where there doesn't seem to be an explicit demonstration of pain on the part of the victims or on the survivors or on the generation that follows? As an Armenian, that interests me because we've put a lot of stock in the fact that transmission of trauma is a real fact.
Right.
But looking at the Cambodian situation superficially, as we were just discussing it before, not to say that you're superficial, but just again the brief time that we had. Yeah. But we there's this idea. Well, what about a whole educational or spiritual system that somehow allows one to move on, or allows one to think that it was fated to be?
Well, there's almost some sort of ideological or cultural complicity at play.
Right.
That the crowd mentality or something that says, okay, this is the way we're going to deal with this. We're just going to push it aside. We're going to sweep it under the carpet and move on. Right. Because we got to roll up our sleeves anyway, right? That British kind of grit your teeth and grin and bear it. But what I'm hearing you say is, hang on, what are the implications of not attending to it?
Right.
So I love the phrase, the corrosive effects of denial.
Right.
I mean, it sounds to me like that could apply very well to Cambodia still as well.
Right. Yeah.
In a different way, though, than Armenia, it sounds.
Yeah, but also there's this idea that perhaps there's this idea of what happens if there isn't denial, right? Like what happens if, I'm sorry, sorry, let's just wait on. Let's just go back. Okay. Question again.
Yeah, so you talk about the corrosive aspects of denial, and it seems to me there's a connection, there's a link to what's happening in Armenia and in Cambodia, and anywhere probably on some level.
But would you say that what's happening in Cambodia is denial, or is it just it's not a state orchestrated denial? We're talking about denial in that case from the individuals themselves. There's this idea of people wanting to suppress.
Right.
Sure. And perhaps even repress their own memory of it for their well-being or their perceived well-being.
Right. Right.
And so their idea
perceived well-being, I think, is pretty critical. It seems to me. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you've always struck me from the first time I've watched your films and met you and so on over the years. As an existentialist, this whole idea of, existentialism would say, Heidegger, Sartre, Nietzsche, and so on, we're running from our freedom. We don't want it. We're scared of it. So therefore, we do X, Y, and Z, which creates the problems we have in the world. Mm-hmm. Is it fair to say that that's what's kind of going on in some of your films, in the sense of your characters are running away from this grief, or at least the way you say it. You seem to be fascinated with this idea of grief and tragedy and so on, but it's about how the character deals with it, right?
Yeah, well,
Isn't
I think we have a lot of situations where characters stumble onto a certain process or a certain ritual or a certain way of living their life that allows them to think that they are dealing with their grief. But what they're not aware of is, in fact, they're accentuating their grief. They're, in fact, they've found a sort of a pattern of behavior which makes them think that they are healing themselves, but because it's unregulated, they veer off course. And they actually find themselves in a place where their lives have become distorted to themselves. And no one there is actually regulating that. No one else is, there's no therapist there who's actually a guiding hand. They're actually ministering to this themselves. And I think many of the films show how disruptive and destructive and harmful that might be, until someone else is able to acknowledge that experience. Someone else is able to see, how they have put themselves in that place because they're not aware of it themselves.
I mean, isn't there something profoundly healing about, in a sense, doing what we're doing right now?
Right.
Connecting, commiserating, saying, hey, I get that, I understand that, let me listen. I think I heard you say recently, or maybe an interview I saw recently, you said, as a director, one of the big skills, the best skills I have, I think, is that I listen.
Right.
I tell my students all the time, as international development workers, we got to listen more.
Right.
You got to go into a community, shut the hell up,
right,
and find out what's going on.
Okay,
and
I guess the question then becomes, what compels us to listen? So there are situations where there is a work, focus of attention, there's a film, there's a book, there's something that gives someone the forum where they are able or have been asked to speak about their work, and that starts a conversation. And that conversation is quite independent from the work itself, much like the conversation we're having right now is not necessarily directly linked to a specific film, but we've been brought to this place because of that body of work.
Right.
And I think that going back to your original question about international relations, I understood that as a diplomat, I would always, and I've noticed this when I've traveled to embassies and there are diplomatic functions, that the diplomat is always actually espousing a state function. I mean, they are, the agenda that they have in front of them is actually mandated by their relationship to the state, as opposed to a free agent. You can't have a diplomat who is a free agent, who is responsible for their own thoughts.
So diplomats build relationships with footnotes.
Absolutely,
right.
And so I think there's been some remarkable diplomats, who have somehow skirted on the edges of that, and sometimes to their. I was fascinated by, there was a Canadian diplomat who I'm sure you've never heard of called Herbert Norman, who was a Japanese specialist who was assigned he was the ambassador of Egypt, where he committed suicide in the early 60s. And this always had an effect on me, because this was like one of our star diplomats. But the more that was revealed about his life, the more we understood how complex this person was, and how the mandate that he had to represent Canada couldn't really contain all the things that made up Herbert Norman. And there were a lot of things he was fighting against. He was the only Canadian who was ever actually the victim of McCarthyism. McCarthyism sort of spread its tentacles up north to really try and reveal who Herbert Norman was. From their perspective, he was a communist. He was someone who was operating against their system. And there was an RCMP investigation and that cleared him. And yet it came up again in his life. And it was something that what he was at the end of the day was a very complex human, and his complexity did not fit the mold that he gave to himself when he decided to become a diplomat. And that he, to answer your question about academics, he would have been much better suited as an academic, right? But he chose this role because somehow it felt that it was at a certain point something that answered to questions he had in his life of what he should do. And he went into this path that allowed him to camouflage aspects of himself, which being a diplomat allows, but that just bubbled up and it sort of boiled over at a certain point. And I only bring up that situation specifically because we're talking about this idea of, in a dramatic world, deciding what it is that people do. What are the actions that actually comprise, what we're watching in the course of a film or a play or an opera, and that is something that's consumed me. It still consumes me. I'm working on a new script, and I spend most of my day thinking, okay, well, there's an infinite number of things that these people could be involved in partaking in or doing or decisions that they make. And as a dramatist, I am orchestrating all of that,
sure,
right?
Yeah.
And I'm orchestrating it because I have the control to create these characters fictionally. In the real world, you can't. You're actually dealing with given circumstances, and you're trying to understand and respond to that. And that's a very different sort of set of skill set than what a dramatist does.
Do you think you're more interested in fiction than facts?
Well, that's a really good question.
There's a reason for asking that, and I want to go somewhere with this, but I'd love to hear your answer.
I think human beings are capable of absolutely anything. So I'm interested in facts in as much as they establish, the spectrum of human behavior. And from that, I get inspired to kind of go off into tangents and to examine things which are sometimes based on fact, but other times are based on conjecture or, but human beings are capable. There's nothing that a human being wouldn't be able to do given the right circumstance or given the right, combination of various elements, that a human being can be compelled to do anything, and that's both horrifying and also inspiring.
I sometimes, part of the reason for asking that question is because I think it seems to me that you are trying, you talked right out of the gate about the human condition and about meaning and so on, and this is where I see the connections to modern existentialism and this whole idea of freedom and choice and responsibility. It's about authenticity, right? That's what or at least what I'm trying to get to here with you, and I think we're getting there, and we're there. And in any good relationship, any good marriage, any good partnership, it's about transparency and authenticity and love and relationship and not to be betrayed at all. But through fiction, I think sometimes, isn't it about what it points to? That's what's really important. So I remember getting into quite an argument with my brother recently, who's clearly quite the logician, because I said words are kind of meaningless. It's what they point to that matters. And that now we're talking about perspective, aren't we?
Right.
And approach. And isn't that the life of a filmmaker and a storyteller?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the big question is, are we drawn to a character first, or are we drawn to a circumstance, that, and then we find the character that sort of paints that? I mean, I think there are the dramatists who are sort of drawn to a particular actor or a particular character that they want to examine, extol, kind of, and then there are these situations and where you find yourself in a world where something has happened to you. I'll give you an example, for instance. My parents had this massive fire at their place, and we had to deal with an insurance adjuster.
It's horrible. Recently, or?
No, this is in 1990.
Okay, a few years ago, but still horrible.
But I had to deal with this person who came into our lives for a certain amount of time and was helping them adjust their claim.
Right.
And so I looked at this person who had the job was quite matter of fact in a way. But suddenly I looked at my parents' relationship to this person, and I realized that, he controlled their entire future. He would decide whether or not the claim that they were putting forward was honest.
Right.
He would, if you said that you had a Bang & Olufsen and the charred remains, he'd be the person who would actually assess whether or not you were telling the truth.
Right.
He would be the person who would be going through the, ashes to see if it was a Bang & Olufsen, whether or not. So I was going, wow, this person, there's something almost angelic about this character.
Yeah.
So that evolved into this film I made in 1991 called The Adjuster, which is about a person who is a compassion junkie who can only actually feel worthy when clients are asking him for help. and he literally doesn't sleep at night. He's like awake all the time, waiting for that call where he is summoned to a fire or summoned to a place where people are in distress, and he can actually apply himself almost like a therapist. But he's completely unaware of it. He seems to be just almost robotic in his approach. And this character is completely fictional. It had nothing to do with the insurance adjuster that my parents were dealing with. But what I saw in that position was somebody who wielded an enormous amount of power for a very brief amount of time, until such time as that claim came through. And then he's sort of forgotten. But I began to fantasize, well, what would it mean to have that job if you were somebody who was searching for meaning yourself,
right.
if you were somebody who was sort of drifting, and suddenly, you had these sporadic, moments of extreme power as you were dealing with devastated people. And would that become addictive? Would it go so far as, would you be looking for a catastrophe? Would you be causing catastrophe because you would want to ignite that need? So there is an element of fact, because I did have a brush with this job, but I'm sure if I wasn't a dramatist, I wouldn't have begun to fantasize about how that role can be elaborated and become something else.
And is the hope, do you think, going in, Adam, to say, I've got this idea about this adjuster and where this story might go, but there's still this revelation, this self-revelation, this self-awareness and growth and so on as you write, as you direct, as you film.
And then your education does come in. You become, you go, okay, well, if he's obsessed with objects and the value of objects, there's this notion of fetishization, Marxist fetishism, and so all these ideas, begin to kind of compound, and you go, okay, well, that's an interesting concept, right? So that sort of, you create a forum where you explore these ideas. And then you hopefully bring in actors and people who are as engaged with those ideas, and that becomes a part of, the film is this machine that harnesses all these different sort of levels of curiosity and intelligence. And if another example, perhaps more, was a film we made a couple of years ago called Devil's Knot, based on the actual child murders in West Memphis, Arkansas, where, no one knows what happened in the forest that day.
Right.
No one knows, as these children went into the forest, what actually happened. There's lots of theories. There's been a number of documentaries. There's been a number of points of views. But 20 years later, we're never going to know. It becomes obvious that we're never going to know. How does the community live with that sort of cataclysm? Where something is so heavily mediated in terms of its after effect, and yet there's a fundamental mystery that'll never be solved. And while you're there, while you're making this film, you're dealing with the personalities, some of the people who experienced it, the actors who certainly are trying to be in touch with the real people, and it becomes a forum, a conversation. It could be that film, which wasn't coming from my own imagination, and maybe I was an odd choice as a filmmaker to do that, but nevertheless, it still is dealing with this notion of trauma and what it means to experience pain and not to have resolution. Like, what do we do with that?
Do you think, I wasn't going to go here originally when I first heard you chatting, but do you think that this is connected to your history?
I
connected
think
to the genocidal edge to your past? Yeah, it has to be, right?
It sort of has to be, because it is this, you're raised with this idea that, your grandparents are in one case, like orphans of this, and so that and you don't have the family tree that your friends have. Like, your family stops at a certain place, and you see that it has not been resolved, and you realize that there's still this distrust and hatred, even towards the people who would have brought this violence against your relatives. When I was in my late teens, early 20s, there was terrorist attacks by Armenians against Turkish diplomats in retaliation for this.
Right.
So you're negotiating all that stuff, of
sure.
course. And of course that becomes part of your worldview.
Yeah, it's got to filter its way into pretty much everything. I mean, that's the kind of conversation film classes will have in 50 years. In 100 years, they'll look back on your work and go, aha, here's one of the layers, one of the threads.
Yeah.
you've talked about recently in the National Post, you wrote I guess you gave a presentation on the 24th, 100th year anniversary, 24th, April 17th, by the way, 1975 is when the Khmer Rouge invaded Phnom Penh and kicked everybody out, and that's kind of, that was 40 years ago, so it was the 40th year anniversary, so there's seven days apart.
Well, so that's very interesting because I think the the Kenyan government has actually acknowledged like Genocide Day. So April 24th is Genocide Day, but it also covers these other acts, right?
Yeah,
and that I didn't see, again, my own ignorance. I didn't know that date.
But
it's also because and again it goes back to this question I had to you. Why is it that present day Cambodia doesn't want that date engraved in people's minds? Like what has allowed that date to fade? Yeah,
and I think to try to answer it, I think some of it has to do with the collective sort of political climate, the ideological implications of this, the fact that it's only started to come out in history books recently at the universities and so on. I mean, it's been a rewriting, and it's kind of ironic. Brian Fawcett, a Canadian author, years ago wrote a book called Cambodia, a book for people who find television too slow. Great read. And he talks about he makes a connection to the media kind of eradicating our memory here in the West, and this is exactly what the Khmer Rouge were trying to do. Back to year zero, we're going to destroy the banks, we're going to wipe out all the intellectuals, we're going to go back to an agrarian society. Well, to some degree, and I haven't really thought about it until right now, until our conversation, that's kind of what's still going on, right? So there's this complicity almost, individually but also collectively, to say, yeah, you know what, we don't really want to know about that. Because I think part of it is a lot of Cambodians just don't know how would we deal with that.
Right.
What would be next?
Right.
For us as individuals, but also as a country. And yet, Adam, the irony is you can't go 100 yards without meeting somebody who hasn't been affected by.
But what does that mean when you say that hasn't been affected? What does that mean when you say you meet that person? You can't go 100 yards without meeting that person who hasn't been affected. How do they let you know they've been affected?
It's good. So so I'd have to reflect on that, but often it's through Q&A and just say, who are you and where did you come from? And sometimes though you do meet folks like this one man, Sun Ratana, I've met recently, who's just only too willing to tell you his story. But does he tell you that story with pain, or is it sort of like, is he resigned to that story? Like what? I think there's a resignation. Yeah. I haven't seen a lot of emotional pain. I think that might have something to do with the whole the Asian, at the risk of stereotyping, the Asian saving face. I don't want to make this other person uncomfortable, but I think there's a resignation there. Yep. This was our lot, and now it's time to move on.
Right.
I think.
Right. Did you see the exhibition at the ROM of the portraits?
I did. That was all from S21. In fact, believe it or not, that guy's name is Niam N. I've interviewed him. I tracked him down up in northwestern An Long Vang, just not far from where Pol Pot was buried. It's a great story. Drive in with a friend and an interpreter. We come up from Siem Reap. We don't know where to find this guy. We don't have a cell phone number.
You mean it was one photographer who did all those images?
It's controversial. There's more than one, but he was 16 at the time. And we drove into town. We sat down to have some food. This is like kind of Wild West town. We ask through our translator, this lady, it's his, the kid that works with her, it's his uncle. It's a town of 40,000 people.
Right.
So we drive around. He's getting a massage. He's local. He's a politician now. Right. So we go back to his office. I sat there for 2.5 hours. We talked through. I mean, it's unbelievable to think that I could have that connection.
Yeah.
But those photos are I mean, they're iconic, obviously, but they're deeply disturbing.
And what has been
to me,
the legacy of those photographs in his life, like of having taken those photographs? What does that mean to him?
Talk about resignation. I mean, this is a very cut and dried. It's the classic. This was my job.
Right.
And if I didn't do this, this is what would have happened to me. Now. Right. The question I would have for him and his family and his friends, could anyone actually peel back those layers with this man and get to the core of the issues and what really went on? Maybe over time, but I think it would be a deep challenge. It's difficult to get to know Cambodian folk. I think you really have to, somebody said to me recently on a trip, a Khmer guy, you want to kill a Cambodian, you got to get to know him. You got to come alongside him. You need to gain his trust. And I think that's true of any culture to some degree, but I'd never heard it put that way before. So there has to be a level of trust before anyone's even willing to come clean. So
and how do you compare that to, for instance, let's say to the experience that Oppenheimer had when he was making, Act of Killing, right? I mean, it's a different culture, but I mean, is it? Are there parallels there in terms of how
I think there are. I mean, I look at some of the characters, Anwar and a couple of the others in that film, and just the almost the glee, the joy that they had about the people that they killed.
Right.
That this was their sense of duty almost. I haven't seen that in Cambodia. I don't know. Maybe it's there. But
I mean, I guess because in that case, I mean, those characters are still considered heroes.
They are considered heroes,
right,
from that
which is
era.
different from Cambodia, obviously. I mean,
I think people at the time, for instance, when the Khmer Rouge came into Phnom Penh on April 1775, they were welcomed. They were cheered. Come on in. You're going to liberate us from the Americans. And in fact, then said, everyone's got to clear out because the Americans are going to bomb, which was a complete lie. You got to get out. And so they kicked them out and said, you can come back in don't take anything with you. You can come back in 3 or 5 days. Well, almost 4 years later, they were slowly allowed back in as a result of the liberation and so on. I think now, looking back, people know that Pol Pot was a maniac of sorts, or at least his ideology. It's almost hyper-communistic in a sense. So it's kind of looking back, you can kind of make sense of it. But I think as somebody looking in, I still have a lot of trouble coming to terms with what went down there on so many levels. It's deeply unsettling for a whole lot of reasons. I mean, I think that's part of the reason why I do this work. You're a filmmaker. I don't write stories. I mean, maybe someday I will. Who knows? I don't know. But more of an academic, I suppose. And it's my own I'm trying to come to terms with these issues in my life. Pain, loss, despair. I come out of a faith-based background, and I find most of the time those answers are just unsatisfactory.
Why? What makes them unsatisfactory?
David Hume said all metaphysical questions should be committed to the flames. Right? Let's just write them on a sheet of paper and let's burn them up because they're pointless. But I don't think that's right either. But I think for me, where the most spiritual contact is between us. It's in a community. It's at church. It's at the Rotary Club. It's in your office. It's on a film set. And so this incarnate kind of inclusion, incarnate inclusion. This is where I think I feel compelled to do the work that I do. Internationally in a development perspective. And I'd like to think that's sort of what's driving you. I mean, what is it? I mean, can you not make films? Can you not tell stories?
I mean, it would be difficult not to be imagining a possible film. I mean, I do think that right at this particular moment, I'm enjoying, after 3 years of very intense activity, doing these 3 features back to back and all this opera work, I'm actually giving myself
Remember,
right. Remember is
coming
up, but I'm trying not to think about physically making films, but I'm still thinking about stories. I'm still, it's difficult for me not to be thinking of narratives and possible stories or reading and sort of allowing my imagination to be in another place. I just think I'm really curious. I don't know.
Sense of wonder, mystery.
Yeah, I don't know what it would mean just to turn that off.
You probably couldn't.
Well, what would be attractive about that?
Right.
Why not actually learn about more about people?
You could always diplomacy. You could always sort of head back that way. I'm sure you've got friends now.
Yeah, I'm not so sure that would be. I think it's a different world. I think I was raised as a kid in Victoria, BC, and my parents were friends with people who were retired diplomats coming from sort of the golden age of Canadian diplomacy, with Pearson years and, like these incredible stories of during the formation of the UN and the Suez crisis and, these, where Canada had a real role as a middle power, and we're not really in that place, anywhere near that place. Our reputation has been so severely eroded. So,
So on that diplomatic line, do you believe in forgiveness? Do you believe in reconciliation? I mean, the subject of your films, your stories, Armenia,
absolutely.
Cambodia.
No, I do. Of course I do. But in order for that to happen, there has to be some sort of demonstration of empathy, and there has to be some sort of feeling of genuine remorse for transgression. I mean, I just think that's very important. I do think that, I'm proud of what this country has done in terms of being able to move towards some sort of reconciliation with the native population by an acknowledgement of the horrors that happened at the residential schools, the acknowledgement of the transgressions. That doesn't, there's no quick fix.
Right.
But as long as we're able to actually exhibit some degree of acknowledgement and an understanding of what someone else has suffered. I happen to belong to a nation where the perpetrator of the genocide against the Armenian people, now effectively the state of Turkey has not made that move, and so I find that is so troubling. As I wrote in that article, that there's been this concerted effort to say the genocide was the result of the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Turks, and I think that we're now at a phase 100 years later where, because of the denial of the current Turkish state, we can see that as a continuation of a sort of a genocidal policy. That it's not just a question of the physical eradication of a people and its civilization, but also the denial of that ever happened. is this way of actually ensuring that the culture will be thwarted. But and that's maybe why Armenians are so resistant and are so adamant about these dates and remembering and challenging that, because we understand how destructive that tendency can be, and we understand that it is an ongoing process. But then you have Cambodia.
Yeah.
I don't quite, I'd like to learn more about that. Yeah. I'd like to understand what are the mechanics of that. I'd like to see, I'd like to see that explored more. I'd like to have that conversation.
I think I really do believe the story hasn't been told enough. I don't think enough documentaries have been made. Right. I know there's another couple coming out. The Gate was at the festival last year.
Right.
So there have been some films made and some certainly more stories, more academic work.
I'd like to, because I remember reading Cambodia,
Brian Fawcett's book.
Brian Fawcett's book. And I'd like to kind of go back.
I'll never. It's a brilliant book. In fact, when I interviewed Joshua Oppenheimer, I gave him a copy. I found it on Aid Books.
Right.
Got it for like $4. It was an old used marked up copy.
Right.
And, I was walking along Bloor Street. Brian Fawcett was sitting in a coffee shop. I went in and I felt so bad, but I said, "Listen, I just got to say really quickly, I read your book back in '92. Huge impact. Thank you." And I shook his hand and walked away. And he probably thought I was a lunatic of some kind, but it had a huge impact on me.
Right.
And then 12 years later to be visiting the country.
Yeah.
I mean, this is where I get excited, Adam, about the little things, about incremental change, about the seeds that a film like Exotica or Felicia or whatever things that you've done that these launching points for thinking about the world in a new way.
Right.
That excites the heck out of me, whether I'm an academic or I'm writing an essay or doing a podcast.
Right.
Social change of one kind or another. I was going to ask you earlier when you were talking about, Armenians and the genocide and so on. Do you think not, you talked about the corrosive nature. Does that make you less of a human in a way? And I don't mean that in a racist, with a racist edge. It makes you less transparent, doesn't it? It makes you less authentic. You're ignoring something. You're avoiding the issue.
Yeah, I think that No, I don't think it makes you less of a human, because I think human beings are capable of that sort of monstrosity.
Sure.
It's just part of being. It's part of being a human. It's not one of the proudest aspects of what the human being is capable of, but it doesn't make you less of a human. It just makes you less of an empathetic and sentient being. Right.
One of the philosophers who I've been starting to read over the last couple of years, Emmanuel Levinas, French thinker. I don't know if you know him or not, but he wrote Totality and Infinity, and he said that, as a result of the 20th century, basically because of the genocide of the 20th century, the 100 million we've killed, all philosophy, all religion has failed. Now what? Now what the hell do we do? Right? And he comes up with, he would argue probably that it's not an ethic, but it kind of is. And he says, the face speaks. As soon as I see your face, it should say to me that I can't kill you. He's a Jewish philosopher. He says, thou shalt not kill. As soon as I see your face, the moment I say you're this type of person, these are the glasses you wear, here's your color of your hair, I can now kill you because I've started to objectify you in some way. And I think there's a real connection there to a better understanding of who we are individually, but also of other cultures. And so Bill Nye was on being interviewed recently and saying, hey, we're all in this together. We're all connected genetically. So what's the big deal? I got the science to prove it, and yet we are frightened by difference.
Well, yeah, and I think that that's what a government is capable of doing is accentuating difference and assigning blame. I'll give you a story. I was asked to speak to high school students about genocide many years ago, and it was at the height of the SARS epidemic here in Toronto. And I thought, okay, what am I going to tell them about genocide, and how does it start, and what does it trigger? And I just had this idea. I walked in the classroom, and I said, oh my God, did you guys just hear the radio? And I said, well, I mean, they basically have determined that the SARS has been brought in by the Chinese, community because they're so dirty. I mean, in Chinatown, and I went in, and I told this very convincing story and they were all looking at me, and I was blaming the Chinese, and I was actually becoming quite angry at the fact that they behaved this way. And then I just stopped and said, who's believing me right now? And everyone put up their hands. I said, okay, I'm just telling you a crock of crap. I'm making this up. But because there was a fear, in that case SARS, and because I was able to actually to give you a narrative which made some sort of sense. Look how willing you were to believe that. Look at the fact that no one here was questioning as I was going off the rails, as I was actually, becoming racist.
Right.
And I was actually, exploiting the fact that there must be something in your imagination that wants to believe that there is a cause. Right. I said there's that very famous example of the teacher that separated kids with blue eyes from brown eyes, right? So that the moment that there is a sense that something or someone will allow you to feel that you are superior or that you are on the right side, we have this frightening tendency to want to believe that narrative. It's and it's been exploited. And very few people will resist that and go back to the Bill Nye sort of idea. Well, we're all connected. Right. We're all, collectively, and even maybe that question that you said about, does that make someone less human? Right. I think the first response has to be, well, no, that is part of our condition. Yeah, sure. We can be terrible. Yeah. We can all be terrible if we're given the permission to. It's like what you're saying about the 19-year-old going to Saigon, if we're given that license, we can embrace that because it's within us. All these things are within us. And maybe when you talk about, Emmanuel Levy, and this history of genocide, that what he's talking about is, that is some sort of empirical proof that philosophy fails us. When in fact, maybe, the other way of looking at it is that, well, maybe philosophy was preparing us for that. Right. That is what, everything leads to that as a possibility. And now, yes, still the question is, well, now what? What do we, what's the next step?
What's the next step?
But I don't think it's the failure of philosophy. It's ultimately, it's all part of this great conundrum of what our experience means, and that is a huge issue, and we're not going to answer that today. But and not that I even propose to have. If we had a year, I don't think we'd be able to.
That's right.
But
that'll be podcast 26 with Adam Egoyan. So we got to wrap up. You're excited about Remember the next film?
Yes, I am. I'm very excited about it because it's also
connected.
Very much so.
Trailer looks awesome, by the way.
It's a Holocaust survivor who's suffering from early stages dementia, who thinks he's found the person responsible for having killed his family in Auschwitz, goes on a mission to hunt this person down, but keeps forgetting why. He doesn't know why he has this gun, why he's in a hotel room.
Memory.
Why, so it'll be interesting.
What it makes it, I mean, if without memory, what are we, right?
Right.
Wow.
Right.
Listen, I can't thank you enough for joining us on Face to Face today. Talk about scratching the surface, but maybe we'll get another opportunity another time. Thanks, Adam.
And maybe scratch the surface with more vehemence and violence.
That's right.
And claw at the surface, and maybe actually dig out huge chunks of the surface until we bleed to death. Yeah.
Thank you.